What's up, guys? Swift here, talking everything NFL draft related when it comes to the Chicago Bears. And one of my biggest takeaways from this year's draft is how the wide receiver and offensive tackle classes dominate this year's draft. This year's crop of receivers and tackles are just special. There are over 8 receivers and tackles in most scouts' top 50 big boards, a much higher number than normal. The classes that aren't considered very strong this year are linebackers, safety, running back, and even the nose tackle position. The Bears need help at receiver and all along the offensive line. So this year's draft seems perfect for us. It's even a pretty good year for interior guys on the offensive line as well, and a lot of centers I like. But the biggest question I have right now is, would the Bears pass on Rome Odunze or Malik Nabers if they fell to pick number 9? It's something to think about here. After the Bears traded for Keenan Allen, it made me think they might be willing to pass on Odunze or Nabers even if they fell to number 9. Or it also meant the Bears didn't think there was that good of a chance that one of those guys would still be on the board at number 9. But on top of that, Ryan Poles doesn't want other teams to know what position he's eyeing. And he also didn't want to overpay this year's free agent wide receivers. But to me, if one of these guys is still on the board at number 9, specifically Rome Odunze or Malik Nabers, I am torn on what Ryan Poles is going to do. Landing Odunze or Nabers would be a huge win if you ask me. They're 2 of my favorite players in this year's entire draft, but there are other ways Poles can leave the draft and come away with a huge win even if he doesn't take one of those guys. Imagine if he traded down from 9 and instead landed Brian Thomas Jr. and Zach Frazier, or Troy Fautanu and Keon Coleman. I've talked so much about this year's draft, and there's a lot to take into account here. Let's remember that Ryan Poles has drafted 10 and 11 players in his first 2 NFL drafts. He's always said he was going to build through the draft, but this year we only have 4 picks, the least amount of any team in the entire NFL. There are 11 teams with at least 9 picks in this year's draft, and the Bears are the only team in the league with less than 5 picks, and one of only 4 teams in the league with less than 7 picks. I am a huge draft guy. I always want more than 4 picks, and I believe in building through the draft. But I do think it's important to note that you don't need a ton of picks every year to build through the draft. So far, Ryan Poles has only made 1 first-round pick out of his 21 players drafted. So maybe he's more worried about adding blue chip talent than drafting a lot more day 3 guys. This year he can add 2 top 10 picks and the first player drafted number 1 overall by the Bears in my entire lifetime. The highest guy we've ever drafted was Mitch Trubisky, and that was just an awful pick. This is definitely something to take into consideration here, is the Bears having 9 picks already next year, and they could potentially get more if Ian Cunningham lands a GM job or if we lose Keenan Allen next year in free agency. So next year's draft, we're already stacked. Another thought here is Ryan Poles could use 1 or 2 of those extra picks from next year's draft in order to get more picks this year. But even if he just takes 4 players this year, he still should be able to draft 35 plus players in just 4 years. And that's definitely building through the draft. Ryan Poles has also used a couple draft picks to acquire 3 potential starters this year and a couple difference makers. He's traded draft picks for DJ Moore, Montez Sweat, Keenan Allen, and Ryan Bates. So it's important to remember that as well. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about pick number 9. That is the pick I'm really starting to dial in my focus on. I think we're taking Caleb Williams at number 1 overall, and I have multiple videos in the works going deep into the QB position and the number 1 pick. But today my focus remains on pick 9. I did a couple of mock drafts yesterday, and I talked about the most likely 4 players the Bears could pick at 9. I want to touch on that again briefly. I've narrowed it down to the 4 most likely players that Ryan Poles would take at number 9 if we stayed there. I've spent an unhealthy amount of time thinking about this and going through different scenarios, and in the spirit of March Madness, these are my final 4 players that we could take at number 9. Let's talk briefly about each one. Rome Odunze is my number 3 overall player in this year's draft. He's a prototypical X-receiver who profiles as a future number 1 target in the NFL and a day 1 difference maker. He's 6'3", 212 pounds, and he ran a 4.45 40 with a 9.91 relative athletic score. He's a freak athlete and such a smooth mover for his size. He has some Jamar Chase and Devontae Adams to his game. I love Rome Odunze. And then we have Malik Neighbors, who isn't quite as tall, but he's just as explosive and even faster. He's also an athletic freak, and he had a 42-inch vertical. He plays much bigger than his size, and he reminds me a lot of DJ Moore. He's also friends with Caleb Williams and plays Call of Duty with him in the offseason. He's another guy who could be a future '1 receiver and should make an instant impact wherever he goes. And then we have Joe Alt, a monster left tackle prospect who is 6'9" and 321 pounds. Plus, he has those 34-plus inch arms. He only allowed 1 sack in the last 2 seasons combined. He scored a 9.92 on the RAS score, and he comes from a school known to produce quality linemen in Notre Dame. My only question with Alt is if he's too tall, coming in at 6'9". I think he's the best tackle in this class, and he would instantly upgrade our offensive line. I think he probably goes before we pick, but for people wanting a tackle at pick 9, root for Joe Alt to slide. And then we have my final contestant of the Final Four. It's Alabama edge rusher Dallas Turner. And I want to be clear here. I would rather trade down a few picks and take Jared Verse than to stay at 9 and take Turner. But I believe Turner would be the guy that the Bears took at 9 if he was still on the board. He has all the traits that both Matt Eberflus and Ryan Poles look for. His length and athleticism. He scored a 9.49 on the RAS. He has those 34-plus inch arms. He also has elite burst and had good production at Alabama, recording 10 sacks last year. I'd say I'm pretty confident that if the Bears stay at pick 9, it would most likely be one of these 4 players. The only other guys I think could get picked at 9 would be Jared Verse, Tali Fuaga, Olu Fashanu, Troy Fautanu, or Brock Bowers. But I'm pretty sure it would be one of these 4. But my other point was this. With Keenan Allen on the roster, I do believe it's possible that Poles trades down from pick number 9, even if one of these guys are still on the board. And in that scenario, if we trade down, I think all of these guys I'm showing on the board now would be potential options. At wide receiver, you have Brian Thomas Jr., A.D. Mitchell, and Keon Coleman. At defensive end, you have Jared Verse, plus Darius and Chop Robinson, Troy Fautanu and Olu Fashanu at tackle, JPJ and Zach Frazier at center, and a couple of defensive tackle options as well. I'm going to continue monitoring the Bears' top 30 visits, and I'm going to scout all of these guys a little bit more over the next few weeks. My biggest point with the trade down options here are that some of my favorite players on the entire draft are featured in this area of the draft. So no matter what direction Ryan Poles goes, we have a lot to be excited about. If we stay at 9, we're getting a blue chip player. If we trade down, we could potentially still land a blue chip player and another potential starter with the pick we get from it. I just can't wait for the NFL draft. And then I can go even deeper in the film room on the guys that we actually draft. Let me know what your guys' thoughts are. I have some big videos on the way. Please remember to hit that like button for me. And until next time, bear down.